Okay, well, welcome everyone to MAD Security's Maritime Town Hall series. Thanks for joining. I'm Cliff Neve, the Vice President of Maritime Cyber at MAD Security. 2025 was a year that revealed some hard truths for our sector, and today I'm going to walk you through what actually happened in some of the ports, terminals, and vessel operations, what failed, what survived, and how we can work together and focus on making 2026 one where we are ready for these challenges and equipped to deal with any of the cyber threats that come our way. For those that don't know me, I'm a retired Coast Guard officer and been in the IT and cybersecurity field with Maritime for over 30 years. So my objective is to help raise the bar in cybersecurity for Maritime. The saying is a rising tide raises all boats. And I hope to facilitate some very open, honest discussions about what we're seeing in Maritime Cyber, bring everybody together and keep our global ecosystem as secure as possible. So what did happen in 2025? Quite a bit, actually. So I want to ground us in these events. And this isn't a theoretical year. It was a very real wake-up call. The first major event was discovery of the broadside Mirai variant. And this was a DVR-based attack. As we get more IoT systems, we have to start paying attention to them. The more bandwidth that comes to our ships, the more IoT devices will be there. DVRs are one such example. And that basically exploited a known vulnerability in video systems, which used widely across vessels. What made it so concerning was that it wasn't just a denial of service attack. It actually harvested credentials, used command injection, established persistence. And in many fleets, it went undetected for months because we don't have a lot of monitoring in place on many of our ships out there. We also saw some port disruptions in Asia caused by ransomware hitting logistics vendors. There were cases where IT went down and the OT systems, depending on IT, were forced to slow or shift to manual operations. Again, the OT wasn't hacked directly, the dependencies were. And so the biggest risk is still folks hacking into IT, pivoting to OT, which is where segmentation will come in, and we'll discuss that later. Another significant campaign came from the Sidewinder APT group, Advanced Persistent Threat Group. They targeted maritime vessels specifically, going after credentials and monitoring activity over long periods. These attacks were successful largely because ships have no onboard security teams and very little visibility into their network activity. And we continue to see ransomware groups target maritime vendors, tug companies, port community systems. These ransomware groups just aren't going away. They're opportunistic. They are targeting everyone. So if you think that you're small and they're not targeting you, you're wrong. They just cast a very, very wide net with large phishing and social engineering campaigns. And whoever they get, and they squeeze as much money out of them as humanly possible. So whether you're a giant organization or whether you're a tiny organization, ransomware is something that you need to be aware of and guard against. Finally, GPS spoofing continued to affect some commercial shipping in the Mediterranean specifically, impacting navigation and port access. And the common thread across these incidents is simple. Maritime systems were compromised, not because hackers are brilliant, but because defenses aren't aligned with modern threat activity. And we're going to go into some of the ways that we can get better at that. Now let's break down how these attackers actually got in, because every incident we analyzed, the patterns were similar. And first, identity failures were the biggest issue. And the Coast Guard cyber protection teams have found that throughout a lot of their investigations and their assessments as well. Stolen contractor credentials, missing multi-factor authentication, shared OT accounts, and excessive permissions were all common. Attackers didn't have to break in. They simply logged in using the credentials they got. Second, unpatched and exposed devices played a major role. The broadside DVR exploit's a perfect example. A single unpatched IoT device became an entry point, allowed attackers to harvest credentials, and then spread laterally across vessels. Third, segmentation issues were everywhere. There's still many flat networks out there, shared Active Directory for IT and OT reachable through corporate systems. This meant once attackers got access to IT, they had a direct path to the operational side, even if it wasn't their original target. Frequently, it's not. But they are going to get smarter to that, and they are going to figure out that the OT systems are a gold mine for them if they can get to them, because the implications of OT network can be significantly greater than IT network breaches. Finally, and this is the most important point, there was a total lack of visibility across most of the maritime community. Most vessels don't have logging or firewall logs, minimal OT telemetry, no centralized SIM, and no SOC watching the environment 24/7. These actors aren't working 9 to 5 central time, they're working 24/7. And so the defenses have to be commensurate with that threat. Without logs, without monitoring, without detection, attackers remained inside for weeks or months, in the case of Volt Typhoon, years, without anyone realizing it. And so the big takeaway, most maritime incidents were completely preventable. But because there was no visibility, no SOC monitoring, no scanning, no segmentation, the attacks were allowed to persist and spread. This is why 2026 must be different. Identity, segmentation, logging, continuous SOC coverage have to move from nice to have to mandatory for operational resilience. The biggest takeaway from 2025 is this: the themes were remarkably consistent, as I said, and the impacts were operational outages, credential-based breaches, OT systems indirectly impacted, vendor ecosystem weaknesses, and SOC blind spots. Just continuing to foot stomp those points before we go into some of the other things. So the real impacts included gate outages and automation failures. They included everything from vessel scheduling systems going offline and not being able to be accessed because of ransomware, container yard slowdowns, manual fallback operations in the case of OT being impacted, and lost visibility in the key process. And what's interesting is that these weren't Hollywood style attacks. These aren't sophisticated multi-zero day layered Stuxnet kind of attacks. These are common hygiene, common sense, preventable type of situations. In 2025, we saw that they didn't break in. Like I said, they logged in. And here's those list of things that I already discussed that need to be on your checklist of things to check on. And this is a simple checklist of things that you can go through and that don't actually cost you any money to do in most cases. They aren't things where you have to buy or pay a lot of money. They're things that policy and process and education can resolve. Uh, Three dominant patterns came about during 2025. And when you boil down all the incidents, the access path fall into three categories: remote access vulnerabilities and VPN misconfigurations, flat IT, OT network or poor segmentation, and logging gaps that prevented detection. If you solve these three, you've eliminated the vast majority of incidents that we saw this year. Other frequent issues that we've seen uh, include OT reachable from the corporate network, shared Active Directory domains. Active Directory is your identity management warehouse. And what you need to do is make sure that your Active Directory is well maintained and well groomed, because that's where, if you're not actively managing roles, actively managing accounts, that becomes the place where most access occurs. The other thing we've seen is no firewall separation. So putting things on their own VLANs is something where you really need to do for compartmentalization. We've talked in this webinar about that multiple times, where your camera system should be on its own network. Your propulsion, your shipboard systems, OT systems should be on their own network or air gapped. And any of your other systems need to be segmented. Your enterprise systems should be logically segmented, and those should be tested, because just because you think they're separated doesn't mean that an attacker can't. And so penetration testing, which is required by the Coast Guard final rule, only every 5 years, which they're going to probably come out and say that best practice is that it's done every year. But the bottom line is that best practice is you should be checking those logical network segmentation policies that you put in place, and use a hacker, use an organization that you can trust to have the technical acumen to be able to determine whether those are actually in place or not. So some of the gaps that we've seen and this is kind of the part that hurts the most. Most organizations didn't capture the logs needed to detect or respond to attacks. There were no Windows logs, no firewall logs, and in most cases, no centralized SIM. So OT devices had no telemetry to monitor or maintain, and SOX monitoring, only certain systems shoreside. So visibility is the foundation of detection. Without it, everything else fails. And a lot of folks came to us. We had on multiple occasions, people came and said, "Hey, we've been breached. Can you find out what happened?" And there weren't any logs to find out what happened. Um, and so that forms the basis. If you have those logs and you can go back, first of all, it allows you to identify advanced persistent threats and identify problems as they're happening and stop that kill chain. But it also allows you, in the event that you are breached, to be able to go back and look at what happens. So you can fix that and resolve it so that it doesn't become a problem in the future. Other issues we saw was weak multi-factor or none at all. Outdated firewalls was another problem. Firewalls that were that aren't uh, current, that aren't next-gen firewalls. SOCs not watching operational technology systems or not having a good strategy for defending OT, whether that's making sure you have network access control on your IT network so that folks can't patch in OT systems, so that they can't plug OT systems just into the IT network. On some of the ships that we've worked on, they've implemented network access control so that if somebody does plug an OT system in, it can't authenticate in, and that's a great strategy as well. Ideally, you'd be also monitoring those systems for anomalies. OT systems, interestingly, I'll take a little side path here. Um, they are very consistent for the most part in what they look like. And so it's actually pretty straightforward to detect if something is awry in your OT systems. Because for the most part, they're not very noisy and they generate a very consistent string of logs and a very consistent behavior pattern in most of these OT systems. So usually if you are looking at them, you can see the anomalies and figure out, hey, what happened here, and go through and detect that something is wrong. The other issues were unpatched remote access devices. We saw a lot of that. And then paper-based or outdated IR plans. We never did a single tabletop with anybody where I would say that they completely had their act together. When we do these IR tabletops, for the most part, people are learning on the fly. They're trying to figure out the roles and responsibilities. And I'll get into that in a little bit as far as IR plans and tabletops, how to run those, and why that's the technical elements of a tabletop are actually quite secondary to defining the roles and responsibilities within the organization, who can make the decision under what circumstances. So what did work? What did we see that was good? There were organizations that did up their game with multi-factor authentication. I think that the Coast Guard's final rule coming out is upping everyone's game, and that's having the desired effect. So folks are more aware and taking more note of the fact that they need to implement strong multi-factor and identity controls. We are seeing some organizations start to do their segmentation. Um, Not as much as we'd like, but we do see that folks are doing IT/OT segmentation and starting to plan for that because of the Coast Guard final rule. Hardened domain controllers were something we saw that prevented a lot of issues. And then, SOC coverage to ships due to Starlink and some of those others are becoming slightly more prevalent. We've had several clients come to us and obtain our 24/7 SOC coverage so that they're able to monitor their ships and have similar protections when the ship is underway as they would with their shoreside counterparts. And then we see an increase in tabletop scenarios being done. The MTS ISAC at their Cyber Summit, we had several tabletop exercises, one for vessels, one for ports, and then one for just overall facilities and the overall maritime environment in general. 2026 is going to be tougher. Attackers understand maritime environments better than ever. There's increased bandwidth, which it used to be we could do a little bit of security by obscurity. It was hard to hack into a ship because it was hard to get connectivity in a ship. But now that there's a lot more bandwidth and more folks are getting larger bandwidth connectivity, then there's going to be more opportunities for hackers to not only deploy a broader set of tools, but also to exfiltrate data quicker than they normally could have. Back in the day when I was on first on Coast Guard ships and we had 64 kilobit per second data circuits, it took a while to be able to exfiltrate significant amounts of data. Anymore, not so much. So we're going to see more OT side targeting. We're already seeing some of these actors understand that ransomware and other things can be more on the OT side can be more damaging and therefore more valuable. It's going to bring some challenges for compliance because the Coast Guard is going to start ramping up their auditing and their expectation of cyber resilience. Training is the first domino to fall on January 12th, which is right around the corner, and then the assessments and all the other items that come out with a multi-hundred-page Coast Guard final rule are going to come into play. So the Coast Guard's going to expect folks to be upping their game in that. And then vendor risk accountability. We've seen vendors get better about taking accountability and taking this more seriously, but in many cases, vendors are the only defense for their own systems. So we're very reliant upon vendors to take this seriously. But we're hopeful that the vendors will start more and more to take this into account as the operators begin to care more and more. That's kind of how economics works. So what are your immediate priority areas? And these are the top priorities, in my humble opinion, for the next 12 months. First of all, identity hardening. And again, not an expensive thing to do. Just avoid shared accounts, put multi-factor authentication everywhere. Network segmentation, reduce the amount of pathways and the attack surface and the compliance scope. That's another goodness of network segmentation and scope. When the Coast Guard comes in and takes a look at your system, there are systems they care about and systems that they don't exercise regulatory authority over. So if you can shrink the scope and take your enterprise administrative out of scope, then you have a smaller surface area to protect, costing less money to protect. Similar to how DoD does the CMMC compliance, we have people who generally are creating their own specialized enclave to defend that data that DoD cares about. And by creating a small surface area, there's less to evaluate. There's less to have to consider. So take a look at those systems that confidentiality, integrity, availability, degradation might result in a transportation security incident. And that's where you really need to focus. And that's where you really need to have a good story to tell the Coast Guard, hey, here are the systems that are in scope. Here's what we're doing. And as we talked about in another discussion, no one knows your network and systems better than you do. And if you're a CISO, it's important that you convey to the Coast Guard your strategy, that you have a good strategy. And I think that if you go into those audits when the Coast Guard comes around and you have the story of, we've simplified our scope to this, and here are all the controls that we've put in place, and we're monitoring, detecting, responding to those incidents. If you have a good story, that's going to make your compliance experience significantly easier. Logging and monitoring, as we've mentioned and foot stomped on multiple slides previous, is going to be something where everyone needs to take a look at that. And it's not as expensive or difficult, I think, as a lot of folks think. And, ships aren't very large in most cases. And, being able to monitor, detect, respond isn't as expensive as I think a lot of folks think it might be. Enable logs, centralize them. Incident response preparedness and doing these incident response drills is crucial. And taking the feedback from those to update your plans, clarify roles, is paramount. And a great example is during one of the tabletop exercises, the example was that you had a ship that was underway, they had ransomware attack, and that the ransomware actors said, hey, we're going to go after your OT systems. Pay your ransom or we're going to take out your engines. And somebody mentioned, hey, we're not going to pay the ransom. And I said, okay, so you're going to make that decision. And they just kind of blinked hard. And I'm like, or is your CEO going to make that decision? You're an IT engineer. Are you going to make that decision that your organization isn't going to pay for that? Or is your CEO or your CFO or your legal counsel? Who's going to actually make that determination? And it was interesting because that became a very non-technical discussion, but a very important one of how do you respond when that happens? Who is making the call of how you react to the threat actors and how you fight your way through that system? So the minimum logging you need, we've talked about logging quite a bit. And what Coast Guard expectations are is you have Windows event logs on, firewall detecting enabled, firewall logging enabled, OT device logs if supported. Some OT devices don't generate logs or don't generate any kind of traffic. Alerts that flow into a SIM, and then IT/OT correlation through the SOC. And depending upon what your strategy is for IT/OT isolation, separation, there are solutions out there where you can monitor systems locally without having a WAN connection. In some cases, it makes sense to monitor those using OT across the WAN so that your SOC actually has visibility into those. And it makes sense based upon your posture to go ahead and network those so you can view those depending upon the case study, the situation. And in other cases, folks say, hey, look, we're going to air gap it, make it a physical security problem. And what we're going to do is put network access control, and do other things. And then our SOC will monitor for any of these systems that are trying to authenticate in that shouldn't be authenticating in. So what you should be doing is, working on what is your strategy and why, and working with folks who are experienced and knowledgeable about this to build your strategy and then implement it. Uh, a note on SOC, because we see all the time where people decide that they're going to try to do this in-house. And unless you're a gigantic corporation, it almost never makes any sense to do so. If you're going to get 24/7 coverage, you're going to need to have 6 to 8 people minimum to cover all the shifts. You're going to have to bring those people in. You're going to have to train them. You're going to have to engineer the system. You're going to have to buy your own licenses, buy your own SIM. Then you're going to have engineers to tune it. Then are you going to have enough people to threat hunt, or are you going to have to buy more people? Training and retention becomes a problem. You have these folks, they're going to get highly trained, they're going to expect a promotion path. How's that going to work within your organization? And then finally, your OT aware expertise. So most maritime operators cannot sustain this in-house. Your maritime organizations, your shipping companies. Stock as a service is generally the fastest, most cost-effective path, and going with somebody who actually knows what they're doing and does that for a living all day, every day, and having somebody that you can trust to do that is absolutely the right way to go for 99% of organizations. So looking at tabletop exercises and drills, there's several different ones that I would recommend. And identity breach is one. A contractor account is stolen, something is logged into, it's breached. How are you going to stop that? How are you going to detect that? A port operations outage, like a gate or a crane goes down, something like that. How do you fight your way through that? Who is responsible for making calls to other organizations? That can also include things like power considerations and things like that. If you have a hurricane, it's not always a person or a group of people. Sometimes it's a hurricane or some type of tropical storm. And then OT focused malware. What happens? How do you respond if you get some type of OT malware in one of your systems? And then ransomware is a big one. And quite frankly, there are a lot of tabletop templates that are out there. If you go to the CISA website, you can actually find under maritime and other places where they have tabletops. So you can go and you can find these tabletop exercises, tailor them to your organization and do that, or you can bring somebody in that's an expert in how to run these, that basically plays dungeon master, right? For those D&D fans out there. But what we found is if you haven't tested it, it doesn't work. And the time to figure out your incident response strategy isn't in the middle of an incident. And that's the toughest way, but it's the way that we see a lot of people go. So why is SOC now essential? IT and OT roles escalation, how containment decisions are made, um, isolation and containment steps, communications plan, authority to operate decisions. So those are where those are essential. Again, let's see, I'll skip that. So how can we help? So like I mentioned, Mad Security does 24/7 maritime SOC for cruise lines, ports, MARAD. We can provide a network segmentation strategy, logging and visibility implementation, as well as compliance support, going through and doing a gap assessment of where you now. That's usually one of the very first steps you take. And it's something that we do for CMMC as well, is that we come in and help with what does your situation look like? What are your workflows? How does your organization operate? Because having that context is pivotal. And having a maritime organization or an organization that's familiar with maritime is key to being able to establish a strategy. And really, that strategy is something that everybody should be working on, as well as the training piece that the Coast Guard is going to be looking at January 12th. But I think right now is the time for folks to be getting their strategy in place and figuring out what their scope is, figuring out what their segments are, and how to logically or physically separate those systems that the Coast Guard is going to care about, or that are important, so that you can protect them appropriately without breaking the bank. And at that point in time, I will go ahead and open it up to any questions that anybody has. All right. What is the first step that you would take? So yeah, so you entered that question right after I answered it. That's okay though. I'll go back to it. So the first step that I always take is putting my CISO hat on is understanding what your workflows are, understanding what your business impact analysis is. What are you trying to accomplish from a business perspective? And what are the systems that tie into that, and which systems, if they're CIA, if anything's degraded, would result in a transportation security incident or loss of profit, etc. So I would take that and say which are my most critical systems and kind of categorize them, and then build your network segments, your zones, and figure out how to protect against those major calamities from occurring, and work on responding to any incidents that might happen on those particular systems. All right. Somebody asked when I think the Coast Guard is going to really start enforcing this. So, uh, kind of a tongue-in-cheek question they asked there. So, but here's what I think. I think that the Coast Guard is um, is going to expect folks to crawl, walk, run, and I think that they're also crawling, walking, and running. They have a finite number of resources out there. Um, I would first of all encourage anyone to take advantage of the CPT, the Cyber Protection Team assessments. Those are absolutely fantastic. Those folks do great work. From everything we've seen with some of the partners that we've worked with, everybody's been very happy with the professionalism and the talent that the Coast Guard cyber protection teams have brought to bear on doing that. So take advantage of that. They seem to have capacity as I've talked to them. But the reality is that they're still figuring it out a little bit themselves, and I give them a lot of credit for the final rule came out, and then they published the FAQs that came after that, which provide a little bit more flavor. NAVIC 0224 just came out that harmonized some of those reporting requirements so that you're not making a million calls to a million different organizations. It really did a nice job in kind of harmonizing where you make your calls, and whether to the NRC and or CISA as a follow-up. Um, but I think that they're going to expect you to have a story. And again, the CISO of the organization is absolutely responsible for the protection of their systems and the continuity of business and the resilience of what it is they're providing. So I think that the best way for the Coast Guard to move forward is to empower and educate those CISOs so that they can manage their networks day in, day out. They're just not going to have time to do deep dives on every single MITSA regulated facility. They just are never going to have the resources to do that, frankly, to do very, very deep dives. So what they're going to be looking for is organizations that have strong strategies that employ all of the common hygiene things and have done their due diligence, and to have a good story. And if the Coast Guard walked into your office today, would you have a good story? What would your story be? Or would it be, well, we have our whole port and we're doing some stuff? I think that it's a much more powerful statement to them to say, here's exactly how we're doing this. We have different zones with criticality ratings that we're doing 24/7 monitoring of, that we're going through. We've put multi-factor on everything we could, segmented things off. We're meeting all the tenets of identity control, the 7 that they listed in the final rule. We've trained our people, and here's how we've done that. We have some specific role-based trainings that we've provided folks that are working on OT systems. But just, I think, having a good story and having a good strategy. And if you do that up front the right way, you're going to save a ton of time and a ton of effort later on. So, all right. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you for joining me. Feel free to reach out anytime, cliff@madsecurity.com, or hit me up on LinkedIn, whatever works. Always here to help. Very passionate about this. I have a lot of contacts too, where if I don't know the answer, I usually know somebody that does, and can network folks in. But I appreciate everybody's time today and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Cheers.